Hello everyone, it's Sammy Osman here from the Climate Action Reserve. I'd like to welcome you all to our public scoping meeting for our soil enrichment project protocol development process. We'll just pause for a couple of minutes and let anybody who's just signing in at the last minute to join us, and then we'll kick off promptly. Thanks. Hello everyone, it's Sammy Osman here at the Climate Action Reserve, and welcome to our public scoping meeting for our soil enrichment project protocol development process. We just paused a moment to let more folks join us, but I think we can commence now. So thanks again. Hopefully the audio is coming through nice and clear. So get comfortable and let's begin. Okay, a little bit of housekeeping to start things off. First of all, most of you will be logged in as attendees, and we will have you all in listen-only mode. So if you'd like to interact with us, feel free to use the chat box function or the question function in the little GUI little app that you'll see. Usually it starts off in the top right-hand corner of your screen. We'll take questions at the end, time permitting. So open that little function up and you can type your questions in there. Please submit your questions through that GoToWebinar question box. All of those will come through and be captured electronically, so we'll have a chance to address those at the end, or if for any reason we don't have time, then we'll be able to follow up with you afterwards to make sure that we're able to answer all your questions. So very welcome feedback. Encourage you all to make sure you do that if you feel like it. And also the slides and a recording of the presentation will be posted online. Towards the end, towards the middle of the presentation, you'll see we have a couple of animations, nice animations built into the presentation. Those are quite large file sizes. So when we upload the slides, we're probably going to have two versions, one without the videos and one with them. So we'll give you an option there to choose those. So if you're having trouble downloading by any chance, you can possibly choose the smaller file size option. Okay, I think that's good for housekeeping. Let's see, a little bit slow, there we go. So just by way of introduction, my name's Sammy Osman. I'll be your main presenter today. So I'm a Senior Policy Manager at the Climate Action Reserve. In a moment, I'll be handing over to our President, Craig Ebert, President of the Climate Action Reserve, and he'll introduce the Climate Action Reserve for those of you who are not so familiar with us. And at a later stage during the presentation, we'll also hand over to chaps from Indigo Ag. So they'll be introducing Indigo Ag's protocol approach. So from Indigo Ag today, we have Ed Smith, who's the Vice President for Terraton and Carbon. And we also have Dan Harburg, who's the Senior Director of Systems Innovation. Just catching a little bit of feedback on the audio there. So if anybody else on the line can make sure you're muted, that would be good until you're ready to speak. Okay, so I'll run through the agenda. just after I get through this agenda page, we'll hand over to Craig Ebert, who will present a little bit of an introduction to the Climate Action Reserve, make sure you all know who we are. Then from there, we'll go through to, you'll come back to me and I'll give you a little bit of a background on soil enrichment projects, a little bit of an intro to why we're talking about soil enrichment. What are we doing here? Then from there, we'll get into a little bit of the development process and timeline. Right at the start here, I want to give you all a reminder, and we'll do this several times throughout, that if you're interested in joining us for the work group, we ask that you submit a statement of interest by this Friday, so by Jan 17th, just a little reminder plug there. From there, we'll move over to an overview of Indigo Ag's proposed approach. So we'll hand it over to the gentleman at Indigo Ag, and they'll run through and give you a nice introduction to what they're thinking, how this will best proceed. From there, we'll come back to me and I'll jump into going through a number of key considerations for protocol development. So right at the start, we want to flag for you some of the more significant challenges that we think will be facing us all together as we develop this. So that'll include things like project definition, aggregation, eligibility considerations, quantification approach, and also monitoring and data needs. From there, we'll wrap up with a little bit of next steps. So what are the immediate next things to expect? And then we'll wrap it up. So Craig, would you like to make an introduction to the Climate Action Reserve?
Thanks, Sammy. I'd like to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. I think, as Sammy mentioned, many of you know who we are. Our mission is dedicated to bringing market-based solutions to address the climate crisis. And we've been working for several years now across North America to ensure that there are high-quality standardized carbon offset protocols for use in both the compliance and voluntary markets. We are an accredited offset project registry under the California Cap and Trade program. But as I mentioned, in addition to that, we have operations across the US, Canada, and Mexico as well. We are based in LA, but if we go on to the next slide, I wanted to demonstrate that the projects to date really do run the gamut across North America and cover a wide variety of different offset types. I'm pleased to really be here today. We all know that the climate crisis just seems to be accelerating, and there's a considered paucity of action across the globe. For those of you familiar with soil enrichment approaches over time, the challenge has always been around a couple of fundamental questions. One, are we capable of measuring, of establishing a baseline for the quantity of carbon in soils? And secondly, are we capable of measuring the flux off of that baseline? That has hampered, frankly, development of soil enhancement projects in the past. We think that given advances in recent years, that the time is very ripe to reassess that. And it frankly couldn't be more important to be able to do that today. Humanity is out of time to address the climate crisis. And not only are we not likely to be able to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions faster, one of the key options available to us are natural working land solutions, whether it's soil enhancement or forestry options or whatever type of project one may be examining. This is one way we can absorb carbon out of the atmosphere, have a variety of wonderful co-benefits, including ecological restoration that will benefit all of us. And so we're definitely have very high hopes for the work we're undertaking here. And I wanted to thank all of you for joining today. Without further ado, Sammy, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Craig. All right, now let's get into a little bit more of a background on why soil carbon. I think Craig touched on soil enrichment. Craig touched on that a little bit, and I'll expand a little bit further. So why are we talking about soil enrichment, and what exactly are we talking about? So as Craig mentioned, there's been growing attention worldwide, in particular around soil enrichment, as it's lauded by many as perhaps one of the most widely available and least costly greenhouse gas emission reduction tool incidentally one that has many co-benefits as well. For instance, the IPCC has told us that increasing soil organic carbon, and we'll use the acronym SOC throughout, and I'll probably say SOC, so forgive me, can possibly reduce greenhouse gases by 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So quite a significant contribution, technical abatement potential. As Craig mentioned, various challenges still prevent large-scale uptake of a means to increase soil organic carbon. So many believe that incentives might be necessary to support farmers to overcome some of these barriers. And that's where we all kick in today. We want to know, can offsets support large-scale soil organic carbon increases? Can this be one of those effective incentives to help support farmers in these practice changes? So what types of activities promote soil enrichment? What exactly are we talking about here? Here is a list of some examples of the types of things which might be contributing positively towards soil organic carbon buildup. The US Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, has developed a good number of practice standards. So they're essentially guidance documents for farmers and others to undertake a range of sustainability-related activities. And here's a number of which are likely to contribute directly to soil organic carbon increases. They include things like crop rotations, cover crops, forage and biomass planting, hedgerow planting, irrigation management, nutrient management, mulching, grazing, tillage management, and also riparian buffers. So what we're going to be doing is exploring, can offsets support large-scale soil enrichment by driving the uptake of these types of activities. Now we'll get into a little bit of an overview of the development process and timeline. It will be a pretty short, high-level overview now, and then towards the end, I'll also get into a little bit more specifics with some key dates in there. So as you can see down the bottom there, we've got a fairly aggressive timeline outlined for us. Today, we're having our scoping meeting. From there, we're going to move into work group formation. As I already warned you, we're asking for anybody who's interested in joining us. Very much appreciate people generously donating their time. We would ask that you submit a statement of interest by this Friday, so January 17th. From there, we'll form the work group shortly after that, so hopefully next week. And we're going to move into drafting the protocol itself immediately. And then from there, we'll engage heavily with the work group and use them as much as we can to vet and build out some of the key ideas and defeat some of those key challenges. From there, once we've got a completed protocol, part of our process is to enshrine transparency as much as possible. We launch into a public comment period. So we announce the release of the finished protocol to the public, and we usually leave it open for at least a 30-day period. And usually in the middle there somewhere, we'll have a public comment webinar. So very much like today, but at that point, we'll have a finished protocol. So we'll be able to show you all what those key pieces look like and give you a chance to explore it with us via a webinar. And then we will invite you to submit written comments, and we respond in writing publicly to all of those comments at the end of that 30-day process as well. From there, very last step is we present all of our protocols to our Climate Action Reserve Board, and we ask them to adopt the protocols. So that's what we'll be doing, and that will be at the end of about a 6-month period. So work group formation, give you a little bit more information about the work group. So really, it's one of the key aspects of our protocol development process. Stakeholder participation and feedback is critical to protocol development. We like this to be as transparent as possible and as best informed by all of you experts out there as we possibly can. So what we'll be doing is assembling an intensive multi-stakeholder work group to advise protocol development and ensure they help us produce rigorous, well-vetted and credible protocol. So with our work group, we strive for balanced representation. So all of these different groups here, we'd like folks from industry, industry experts, project developers, offset project developers that is. Given that we're focusing on soil organic carbon in farms, it would be helpful if we could have some farmers involved as well, environmental NGOs, verification bodies, independent consultants, academia, in particular scientific community, and also government bodies. Any interested stakeholders are invited to submit a statement of interest, SOI form. And again, drumming this in many times, The deadline for submitting that form is this Friday, January the 17th. We've got a good number in already, but I know that there's at least a few of you on the webinar today who are still planning to send one in. So I'd encourage you strongly to do so, and thank you very much for that. Get it in by Friday. Here's a link to the SOI form, but if you'd like, you can also go to our Climate Action Reserve website, skip the how part, go straight to protocols, go down to the list to soil enrichment, click on that soil enrichment page, a lot of useful information there, including a link to the SOI form. Now, a little bit of a warning up front, we are hoping that all of our work group will be actively involved in helping us work through some of the key challenges. So the participation in the work group requires a commitment to probably around 3 work group meetings, plus additional protocol reviews, familiarity with the processes, technologies, activities for which the protocol is being developed, and also a solid understanding of project-based greenhouse gas accounting. That would be the ideal scenario. Folks that meet that definition, if you can join us, we would very much appreciate your assistance. So a little bit more about the process. So reserve staff will identify and solicit feedback on specific protocol criteria. So similar to what we're doing today, but obviously in a lot more detail as we join with those experts to build out those key areas. So we'll schedule and hold between 2 and 3 meetings. I think 3 would be great, but possibly 2. And we'll produce a draft protocol. And at some point, the work group would get a full draft, and they'll be able to go in and read it from front to back and give us as much feedback as they choose. And then we typically revise the protocol based on that very good level of engagement with the work group. Often, a lot of lessons learned from the experts so that we can refine those and ensure that it's as robust as possible. In terms of expectations, I mentioned those already. Hoping the work group members will review, comment on, and provide recommendations on specific protocol criteria, participate in those 2 or 3 work group meetings via webinar, and provide written comments. So providing written comments throughout, and then certainly at the end, during the public comment period, then work group members have a chance to also submit comments publicly. Okay, now we'll hand over to our colleagues at Indigo Ag to give us a little run through of how they think the approach is best suited at this time. Would you like to say a quick hello, Dan or Ed?
Sure, happy to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So this is Dan Harburg, Senior Director here at Indigo Ag. I just want to start off by saying we're really excited to work through this process together with the reserve, and certainly as we move into the next phase as well, in partnership with the working group, to refine some of the ideas that we'll talk through today. And this is a first starting place for how we've been thinking about the development of this methodology. But we're really looking forward to working with all of you on refining this process and making it work for as many growers as possible. Just as Craig said at the onset, we're highly motivated by what we think is the scalability of this opportunity and its ability to have an impact on climate broadly. So thank you, Sammy, for bringing us into this, and Craig as well. And we're looking forward to presenting here today and working with you all to come. So what we wanted to do today was provide a bit of an overview of the proposed methodology and some components of the project as we envision it now. So just to start by giving a bit of an overview of how this process will work. Sam, if you want to click into this slide, I think the individual icons may show up one at a time, so you can click forward through it to just pop them all up if you want to start, and I'll speak to them as we go. The project as we've proposed it would essentially start with growers enrolling in a carbon offset program. We would then be establishing baselines across each one of the operations enrolled. One of the really critical components of this is actually supporting growers in making transitions to practices that are sequestering carbon. And so we have as the third point in here, being able to provide that support from Indigo. There's a number of data elements, of course, that then must be gathered. Some of those have to be manual. They can't be inferred remotely or determined from a piece of equipment. So, we have a data collection process, which we'll talk through a little bit in a few slides, for picking up each of the elements that is needed. Those data inputs then feed into models that essentially look at quantifying the amount of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, as well as increases or changes in soil carbon sequestration that have happened between the baseline scenario and the project scenario. The offsets would then be calculated, verified, and validated. We would then also establish sale of those credits then within the market and transfer the value back to the grower. So essentially what you're seeing here is end-to-end from the quantification approach, as well as the practice support for growers through to data collection and sale of credits, all happening sort of within the Indigo. And we use the Teraton initiative here at the top, and you see Teraton show up a few times throughout this as well. You can think about this as a single unified initiative whose mission is to try to enable as many growers as possible to support the transition to carbon farming. So we'll use those terms a bit interchangeably here throughout the presentation. If you jump into the next slide. All right, so why is this needed? I think you touched on this here at the beginning as well of the presentation. Certainly there are a number of existing methodologies in the world today that cover various aspects of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as soil carbon from the Climate Action Reserve and others. And we believe that while many of these approaches are powerful, none of them combine the best of technologies that we have today to enable impact at scale and the generation of as many credits as possible for a given farming operation. And so the hope here is that through this process in collaboration with the reserve, we can get to a protocol that has that ability to scale and has the ability to scale cost effectively across operations. And I think through some of the proposed approaches that we are presenting here today, as well as what we hope to work through with the working group, we hope to arrive at a place where we can have both the combination of scale, and cost effectiveness. That trade-off between sort of rigor and feasibility is something that we'll come back to in a few of these different, we'll touch on that a few times throughout this presentation, but it's a really critical element of sort of finding the right balance that will allow for impact at scale. So if you step into the next slide now. So, talked a little bit about this in the previous slide, but of course there are two trade-offs that we highlight here for different methodological approaches for creating carbon credits. Of course, you can have high costs and low costs in the approach that you're implementing for quantifying carbon, and you can have high and low accuracies. And if we think about approaches that might either favor sampling or favor modeling, there are trade-offs that are being made in both of those types of protocol approaches. Sampling heavy, which is similar to some of the protocols, for example, that are used in Australia, have the challenge of being higher in cost. While they may deliver higher accuracy of crediting and be able to account for wider changes in the types of practices that are being implemented on farms. On the other side, though, you have model-only approaches, which, while possibly scalable and therefore lower cost, because all they require is essentially just inputs for models, their accuracy or the uncertainty is much higher, and so the accuracy with which they're able to predict changes can be lower, or a discount may be applied that ultimately results in fewer credits being generated than otherwise would. So both of those sort of trade-offs on their own are significant, and we don't think we're likely to get to the ideal spot with the version 1 first approach that is developed here. But one of the really important things that we're proposing to do is to have an adaptable methodology that dynamically changes over time as we make improvements to modeling approaches, as we make improvements to soil sampling technologies, as we get a better understanding of what practices yield what kinds of results. And so this is a living, breathing, dynamic approach that we think is best, that will start sort of already considering a combination of sampling and modeling, and then make improvements over time as we enroll more growers. If you jump to the next slide now. So there are a number of elements that we're proposing to leverage as we go about the development and implementation of this methodology. So one that I've talked about already is combining sampling and modeling. Another one, which we'll talk about on the slide after this, is sort of project-based grouping of growers such that you can try to reduce the overall data load as well as sampling requirements across the project, and we'll touch on that here in a moment. The second category of differentiators is around universal accounting. So trying to create a single methodology that looks at all sinks and sources of greenhouse gases on the farm. The third is trying to simplify the approach to additionality. And we'll also touch on this in a few slides, but essentially establishing additionality just based on practice changes for a specific set of practices. And the final piece is around leveraging technologies that will allow us to scale to any size of operation anywhere in the globe. And that involves using things like remote sensing. Ultimately, we want this type of approach, we want this methodology to be applicable to a smallholder farmer in a remote part of the world. And we think that's really where this gets us to global scale and to having the most climate impact. So we're thinking about that from the very beginning of the program. So we'll touch in the next slide on the first category around advanced technologies. So the approach that we're proposing combines modeling and sampling. It is leveraging biogeochemical soil carbon models in order to make accurate predictions of greenhouse gas impacts for some of the quantities that cannot be directly measured. So essentially, by leveraging in-field sampling of starting points for soil carbon, we can use those inputs in a biogeochemical model to look at changes in nitrous oxide, changes in methane, changes in emissions, as well as changes in soil carbon. We can then come back and remeasure the soil carbon levels in those fields and compare those to what was predicted using the biogeochemical models and true up the model's results for those changes in soil carbon. So, of course, that not only requires in-field soil sampling, but it also requires very high-quality management history data, and some of that will be provided by remote sensing. Some of it will be provided directly by farmers, and we'll show that in a few slides here, sort of how we're going to be doing that data collection. So if you step into the next slide, I mentioned as well that one of the critical components here is proposing a grouped project approach. So essentially, this is trying to say that there will be a lot of farmers enrolling within this program, we hope, who are in similar geographies, similar soil types, taking on similar types of practices. And so in order to try to balance between rigor and feasibility as best we can and arrive at a cost-effective and scalable approach, we think it's important to group together growers from within the larger cohort in order to essentially sample just representative sets of each one of the different strata of growers that enroll in the project. And so this is an approach or a component of the methodology that we're definitely looking to refine together with the working group, but we think it's critical in order to draw that balance between rigor and feasibility. If you go to the next slide here, just to talk a little bit more about that grouping approach. So the way that we're proposing to set this up is set an initial sampling fraction of the population for which we would go and collect soil samples and collect management practice data. Across every single participant in the program, we would still collect a significant amount of remote data as well as farm data. But then for some fraction of the growers enrolled in the project, such as 6%, we would be collecting even more data and soil sampling. Stratification would then take place by grouping growers into like groups, and that has the benefit of improving our accuracy and also reducing the overall sampling percentage across the whole project. So the data would be collected then across participants within these different strata, and the carbon benefits of each representative grower, and therefore each of each total strata would then be calculated in order to determine the amount of carbon sequestered or reduced across the entire project. Any uncertainty deductions would be applied within those groupings, and essentially, each time that process of stratification would take place, it could be refined over time to improve the overall accuracy of credits generated within the stratas. So within the project, there are a number of different types of fields that we're proposing to have. So some fields, as I just described, would be sampled. Some fields would be grouped. And the combination of grouped fields and sampled fields essentially represents the whole portfolio. The grouped fields, we would still collect management data. Of course, we would be able to collect a lot of remote sensing data to fill any gaps in for that management data. And then on the sampled fields, we would be collecting soil samples we're proposing initially about a 5-year frequency. We have a third type of field, though, that we think is critical to have in the overall program, and we call that experimental fields here. The goal here is really a few critical pieces. One of them is that we recognize that many of the models today don't accurately capture the complexities of stacking multiple practices on top of one another, or the potential benefits, for example, of more complex blends of cover crops combined with other techniques that some might consider sort of advanced. And so, we think those types of stackings of practices may be the approaches that yield the most increases in potential credits, or the highest number of credits being generated. But we want to be able to make improvements in the models and in our understanding as quickly as possible. And so one way to do that is to try to sample a certain number of fields within the project at a more frequent time step, as well as a more spatially dense way, and collect more data at deeper depths upon those acres. And so we are proposing to have a representative set of different types of growers within an experimental grouping of fields that will be spread across the geography of interest. If you jump into the next, So I mentioned universal accounting. For us, this means we would like for the same methodology to be able to cover CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide across a number of sinks and sources on the farm to try to do, whole farm accounting. The goal here being that we want to make sure that we're not looking to incentivize a single source or sink of greenhouse gases without accounting for the change in another form of greenhouse gas emissions. That would mean that we're sort of looking at just the beneficial area for the farmer, but not a beneficial climate impact. And so, as well as ensuring that a grower is being paid for all the good work that they're doing, because there is synergies as people start implementing certain approaches on the farm between the benefits that they're realizing. So the proposal here is that the methodology would cover each of these sources and sinks. So to spend a few minutes on additionality, we believe that this is clearly a very critical topic and one that can be quite complex. What we're proposing and would look to work with the working group further to refine is to establish additionality based on changes in practices. And so, we have a number of reasons why we think this is important. We think it's important to be subjective in the argumentation over the barriers to implementation. We want to limit the verifiability of the justifications for additionality. I'm sorry, these are sort of previous approaches to additionality have had these as challenges, but our proposed approach for simplifying additionality, we believe, would enable all growers to be eligible simply based on adjusting the practices they're implementing on their farm, and then being able to verify that change in practice via self-attestation, remote sensing, and on-ground indicators. So we are setting up data collection systems that will be able to stack both remote monitoring, on-ground indicators, and sort of data that is coming directly from the farmers, such that we can verify whether a grower is in fact additional or not. jump to the next slide. So one of the reasons to argue for such an approach to additionality is that the deployment of practices, especially as you start looking at the stacking of multiple practices across farms in the US, is very low. We hope and believe that many farmers, as they begin to see the benefits of transitioning to these climate smart practices, will implement multiple practices, and that we can start to drive these adoption rates to be significantly higher. But as you can see here, the percentages for 2 practices or more is already less than 5% across the U.S. And so we believe that because such a small portion of growers are currently implementing these practices, there's a strong argument for why simply enacting these practices would count for additionality. And then in the next slide, you can see our initial proposal for what the practices are, the list of practices for which we would be qualifying additionality across specific decisions that would be made around things like fertilizer and irrigation through to tillage or cover crop planting, or different ways of changing the rotational schedule for crops. So in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the scalability. So we mentioned remote monitoring tools. What you're seeing here on the right is a continuous feed of NDVI imagery. You can see the time step there at the top of the image of essentially tracking a specific geography throughout the year. Indigo has the capability to leverage this type of remote monitoring to do things like crop detection, as well as being able to, what we've done in the past, of forecasting yields. But we think that over time, remote sensing will allow us to forecast changes in carbon, likely indirectly through leveraging other models. But this type of technology will allow us to reduce the number of data elements that any given farmer has to provide in order to take part in this type of program. And ultimately, it may allow us to move to new geographies where data can't be collected, and to do both monitoring and verification of practices. So another really important element is being able to collect in-field data from growers at the lowest lift possible. So what you're seeing here on the right is effectively a TurboTax of agriculture, a software platform that we've built here at Indigo that allows for the enrollment of fields in Carbon. What you're seeing on the right there now is a map of a field that is pinpointing where within the field soil sampling events are taking place. So not only could such a tool be used directly by growers to implement, to input data elements, it can also be used by agronomists or field specialists or third-party soil sampling companies in order to go in and record, for example, what you see here, a bag of soil that has been collected from a specific location that can then be geotagged and shipped to a lab for processing, but allowing for the simplification of that tracking and tracing of data throughout the process. So these types of software tools, we think, have the ability to drastically reduce the effort for a grower as well as other participants in the program, and ultimately reduce the cost of every credit that's being generated. So we think they're quite critical to the viability and scalability of the program. And then one final note, and obviously we're sort of just getting into the beginnings of this here, so looking forward to discussing this further with all of you through the working group and other interactions. But as Indigo is set up to work very closely together with our farmers, that connection to growers is revealing a number of practical considerations that we think have to be taken into account as we set up these types of methodologies. So I've talked a few times about the trade-offs between rigor and feasibility, but clearly in order to have a well-positioned program here, we need to find the right balance between rigor and feasibility. We think that by being invested heavily in grower relations and having on-the-ground experience with our growers today, having the ability and willingness to be flexible and creative as we find out what elements of data are harder or easier to capture, or harder, easier to verify, as well as having remote sensing expertise and software tool capabilities in-house that we're well positioned to try to draw that line between rigor and feasibility in a way that creates a scalable program here. So we look forward to working with the Reserve and all of you on implementing that.
Hi, this is Ed from Indigo as well. Just one thing to add, which is, we touched on quite a few things that Indigo has and Indigo is capable of doing. But obviously, the way the Reserve works, they will own this methodology. It will be quite public. And there are plenty of other folks in this space doing really interesting things. Agrible is one, Land O'Lakes is another. Pachama is doing really interesting things with satellite technology. So we offered glimpses into some of the technology that we're doing, just as a suggestion of what is possible based off of Sammy's comment earlier, that the technology available today could make this type of protocol newly feasible. And so we just wanted to give examples here, but the ultimate intention, obviously, working with the Reserve, is that this would be a protocol that any project developer could use in order to help take carbon out of the atmosphere and provide additional income streams to growers. So we're really excited about the collaboration moving forward.
Great, thanks Ed for making those opening remarks and also those closing remarks, and also to Dan for walking us through Indigo Ag's approach there. Thanks to both of you. So now we'll move on to exploring some of the key considerations for protocol development. So a lot of these issues, well, we listed a few at the start, and then Dan certainly touched on a lot of those during the presentation of Indigo Ag's approach. So now we'll sort of circle back and just at a little bit of a higher level, sort of talk through some of those key challenges on the next few slides. We can get it moving. Yes. So here's, again, a little simple list of some of the issues that we're going to go through on the next few slides, just some of those key challenges ahead of us with this development effort. So we're going to go through, first of all, project definition. Then we're going to go through some eligibility issues. We're going to go through some permanence considerations, aggregation, quantification, and monitoring, reporting, and verification. I have to warn you that we sometimes abbreviate monitoring, reporting, and verification to MRV, so you'll see that on the next few slides. Just make note. So yeah, we'll try to identify, well, we've already identified these, but we'll explore them in a little bit more detail. We'll talk a little bit about the key challenges themselves, and then we'll also start to tease out some of those options. So clearly, we just had a great introduction to Indigo's proposed approach. So we'll talk through some options there, including the ones that Indigo's put forward. And this is by way of introduction to exactly what the nature of some of these challenges are and how we think we might be able to move forward. So in terms of project definition, the list that I just went through there is actually the sort of same order that it'll appear in the protocol. So we'll start off with the definition right up the front, and then it sort of progresses on from there. So in terms of how we're likely to define the project itself within the protocol, at this point we think the definition of the project is likely to include eligible activities and practices, eligible locations, and eligible crops. So in terms of activities and practices, a few slides back there, we went through those USDA, NRCS practices there that they're promoting. So these will be, likely be a subset of those that end up being eligible under the protocol. So at the outset, we're thinking very much we're going to be focusing on regenerative practices relating specifically to cropping. So it'll be things like cover crops, tillage practices. So that might involve, for instance, moving from regular tillage through to perhaps no-till. Indigo's slide previously identified quite a number of different options there that could quite possibly be useful for building soil organic carbon. Also incorporating of livestock, and that will include things like building out forage. But for us on the GHG accounting side, more importantly, it'll also include accounting for the impacts of the manure, for instance, the greenhouse gas impacts of the manure. We'll also explore GHG impacts of fertilizer use efficiency, so trying to drive efficiency in terms of in particular the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. We'll also explore irrigation practices, so that might include efficiencies there, and then also associated fertigation and issues like that, and how those might impact GHG accounting, and in particular the soil organic carbon. In terms of locations, ideally, as Dan said, ideally in the long run, this protocol will be applicable for the entire planet. But at the outset, we're going to be focusing on the US. So that'll be the priority to start with, trying to make sure as much of the US is eligible as possible. And then from there, if we're able to, we'll try to expand that outwards. And then in terms of crops, we anticipate at this stage, we hope to have perhaps a positive list of specific crops that will be eligible. Again, a lot of this is going to be dependent on data, and we've already explored that to some extent, and we'll get into that in the coming slides. But ultimately, at this point, we think it's very likely that what we'll end up with is a list of eligible activities, practices, locations, and crops, and eligibility will probably depend on a combination of those factors. In other words, for any given location, it's likely that only a subset of the activities and practices and crops will end up being eligible for that specific location. And in essence, it boils down to the data that we're able to capture and process in relation to that combination. But this is at the outset, and basically just trying to give you a high-level overview of what we think it's likely to feature in terms of the project definition. And again, as Dan said, ultimately we will look to expand that over time. So whatever finite list we come up with, assuming that's how it eventuates, we will continually work to try and expand that to be as broadly applicable as possible. Some further eligibility considerations, we'll touch on additionality, and then there are a number of other questions, some of which relate to additionality and others which relate to eligibility more broadly. So in terms of additionality, this is a somewhat conceptually challenging when it's first sort of introduced to folks. It's a term that's common in the offsets marketplace. What it essentially means is that when we issue offsets, we need to ensure that we're only crediting for actions that go beyond what would have occurred in the absence of the project. So in that sense, they're considered additional to what you would have done yesterday before the project started. As Dan touched on, what we're hoping to be able to do here is to use a practice-based approach such that we look at what practices was the farm implementing in the baseline, so what practices was the farm implementing prior to the project, and then hopefully a farm can then choose one of the eligible list of activities for their particular region and start one of those new activities, and hopefully it can be that transition from what they were doing in the baseline to at least one or more new eligible practices, and we're hoping that that change and addition of new practices can be the basis of our additionality criteria for the protocol. That's what we're hoping at the outset, and certainly we'll keep you posted on that. In terms of some other key questions, how many years before before the start date do we need to evaluate the baseline? So if we're looking into the past, how many years worth of data, how many years worth of practices do we need to assess? Is 1 year sufficient? Should we do 2, 3, 5? Certainly a big variety amongst the pre-existing protocols in terms of how exactly we frame the baseline. So that'll be a key consideration. How do we cost effectively verify baseline information is accurate? Obviously, the further back in time we look in order to establish the baseline, the harder it's going to be to bring together robust data to demonstrate that those claims with respect to historical practices are supported, and then also for third parties to verify that information becomes more challenging. So there's a bit of a balance that we need to strike there. Next, how many practices should we require for the combination of practices to be eligible? You might recall that Dan had a slide up previously which showed that the number of farms that are currently adopting one practice, one of these regenerative ag practices, is pretty good at the moment. And as soon as you get to 2 practices or 3 or 4 or 5, that curve starts to drop quite a bit. So we need to strike a balance there again, and ideally we can have it so that that the least possible number of extra practices that's started up will be used as the trigger for additionality. So that's a balance that we will have to explore closely when we're developing the additionality threshold. Next, what impacts should any new legal mandates have on crediting? For instance, if one or more of those key practices suddenly become mandated by law, how should that affect crediting? Should we cease crediting altogether at that point, or somehow restrict crediting going forward? Or should we allow crediting to continue for at least a certain period of time? That's another key consideration that we'll have to take into account. And lastly on the list here, how should we handle regulatory compliance? What that means is, how should we handle if certain laws are broken by that farm or by any of these actors involved in the offsets project? For instance, if the farm is next to a river and unfortunately a lot of pesticides or some sort of chemicals end up in the river and they get in trouble with the regulator, how should we approach that as the offset program? Should we cease crediting, hold crediting? That's another key exploration that's of keen interest to all parties involved in the carbon market. So that'll be a key area of focus for us as well. Permanence. So what do we mean by permanence? This is another term that's common in the carbon market, but probably needs a little bit of introduction for folks who are a bit new to carbon markets. So what permanence means is essentially that for each ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that's sequestered, it must remain secured for 100 years in order for us to think it's a validly created carbon offset. From there, we consider that any releases of sequestered carbon are called reversals, so that's the term we use, and then any losses must be replaced. So in other words, for every offset that we issue, it's equivalent to 1 ton that's been sequestered or trapped, in this case in the soil, and we need it to stay there for 100 years. If for some reason it doesn't and it's released again after 50 years, well, that offset has been sold to another party. We need to make sure that the credit that other party has purchased is still valid. So we need to replace that lost carbon. And that's what we mean by permanence. And so there's obviously a little bit of a challenge there to make sure each offset is secured for that 100 years. And here we've got listed a number of approaches that are used commonly in carbon markets to approach that challenge. First of all, buffer pool contributions. Now, these are used widely, in particular in forestry carbon offsets. And what the buffer pool contribution essentially means is that each time a credit is issued, each time credits are issued, a certain percentage are held back and placed in a central pool. That's the buffer pool. And that pool is then used to replace those reversals that we talked about a moment ago. So if, for instance, in a forestry setting, if there was a wildfire came through and burnt down all the trees, well, then that party might be able to look to the buffer pool to be able to replace those tons that were represented in the trees that just got burnt down, and those tons were then released back into the atmosphere. So that's one valuable mechanism that's used in particular in forestry projects that we think might be useful here. Secondly, legal agreements. So often there are legal agreements imposed with restrictions registered on the title to land itself. A good example is a conservation easement. So let's use the forestry example again. It might be that you want to protect your forest for a carbon offset project, and you might put in place an easement on your land, and the easement would then be lasting for at least 100 years, and that way it could be seen as a really good way to reduce the risk that those trees are going to be cut down, because we have an easement in place that specifically says don't cut down those trees. Thirdly, there's a principle called ton-year accounting, and in essence what this does is it says that we can issue less offsets in return for a shorter commitment. In other words, if each offset needs to be in place for 100 years, then how about we reduce that to 1/5 of the issuance? How about we only issue 1/5 of the credits, and therefore we only need them to commit to a 20-year period as opposed to a 100-year period. That is a relatively new process that has been used a number of times. For instance, we use it in our Mexico forestry protocol, and it seems to be going well. But it's relatively new with respect to carbon programs, but certainly we will be looking to explore all of these and any other approaches that we think might be suitable in order to address this key challenge, which is the permanence of the carbon that's sequestered in the soils. Aggregation. So aggregation is touted widely as perhaps a very useful tool in order to reduce transaction costs. So what does aggregation mean? In essence, as the definition of the word suggests, it basically means bringing together, in this case, multiple farms, with the idea being by pooling those together, we can improve efficiency. So why would we consider this? Well, in essence, transaction costs associated with developing an offset project typically make it so that very, very small projects are going to be cost prohibitive. In the context of agriculture and cropping, that could be, an acute challenge. It is a relatively new area for the offsets market, and certainly aggregation is looking like it's going to be quite a useful tool to use. So, in essence, we'll try to facilitate bringing together as many farms as possible into a larger, more cost-effective group. Here we've got a couple of examples of approaches that could be useful to describe how we might go about it. This is not necessarily industry-specific terminology, but just by way of simple example. So we're sort of drawing a spectrum here. On one side, a little bit more of a simplified or limited aggregation approach might be that you allow for multiple eligible fields or farms to come together as a group of projects. So it might be that each field or each farm, each group of fields, each farm could be considered a project. And then what we would do is we would facilitate them coming together to undertake some of those monitoring, reporting, or verification activities together. So there's still individual projects, but let's say we were able to group them together and they can do some of those procedural administrative steps, the monitoring, reporting, and verification together. We might be able to realize some efficiencies by doing that. Excuse me. On the opposite end of the spectrum, let's try to imagine more of an unlimited aggregation approach. So right at the other end of the spectrum, perhaps we were able to facilitate there being no limits on the amount of fields, farmers, crops, practices, even geographical locations that are eligible can come together in a single project. So not only a bunch of projects grouped together to undertake some of those core functions, perhaps we'll be able to facilitate all of those people coming together in a single project, and that may be able to realize even more efficiencies than the other approach. We will be exploring both of these, and hopefully we'll be able to end up with these more towards the latter part, more of the flexible option. Quantification. So the next few slides will be exploring some of these in a little bit more detail, but Dan also went through a good number of these and gave us a great idea about what Indigo Ag's thinking at this point. So 3 of the more common approaches that we see with respect to soil carbon in particular are the use of biogeochemical models, and there are several out there that are very well regarded, very useful for this purpose. And they're essentially process-based models, and they're used to estimate greenhouse gas impacts from a wide variety of actions, in particular systems approaches. The second major approach to soil organic carbon greenhouse gas accounting is direct measurement. So in this approach, basically soil organic carbon changes are explored through the extraction of samples that are then measured. In other words, get the shovel out and we dig up some soil, and the soil is tested directly through measurement approaches. The third is the use of emission factors. So those that aren't familiar, emission factors are essentially typically very conservative averages for key parameters. So there are a good number that are in existence. As I mentioned, they're typically quite conservative. So we would look to use those existing emission factors, or perhaps develop brand new ones specifically for this protocol. And I can tell you right now, we will be exploring, as Dan said, a combination of all of the above. So now we'll take a little bit more of a look of each and basically take a look at some of the pros and cons associated with each. So these biogeochemical models are essentially process-based models. What that means is they're very powerful, fairly complex models that are able to look at the greenhouse gas impacts of very complex systems. So we're talking about soil carbon here. Anybody that's familiar will know that soil health, soil carbon building up is a very complex interplay of a bunch of different living systems. It's not just a simple matter of let's push this button and this thing here increases. They're actually very complex relationships. So these are very powerful models, very powerful tools that are able to analyze those complex relationships within those living systems. Obviously, if we're doing that, if we're sitting in our room, we've got the laptop out and we're playing around with these tools, that could quite possibly forego the need for direct measurement, and there might be some significant benefits associated with that. Dan touched on, for instance, it could quite possibly be cheaper in a lot of scenarios if you don't have to go out into the farm and take a core of soil out of the ground and carefully bring it in and send it off to the lab and get it analysed. It might be that using these models is a cheaper option. And then for a verifier to come in and replicate that could also be cheaper. So that's some foreseeable pros there. In terms of cons, these are very powerful models that are able to explore these very complex relationships, which means the models themselves are invariably fairly complex, which means in turn, relatively time consuming for us humans to learn how to use them. And then also when it comes time to operating them each and every time we want to run the model, it also takes a fair bit of time to make sure that the model is able to process the data that we feed into it. Uncertainty can be relatively high compared to, let's say, the direct measurement approach. A good number of these models are most accurate at very large scales, but if we're starting to zoom in on a specific farm, on a very specific field, the level of accuracy drops, the level of uncertainty goes up. Also, very importantly, it requires extensive data to be able to validate these models. In essence, we need to get as much data as possible. We feed it into the model then understands what the likely GHG impacts of those data points that it's fed. It learns these various scenarios, and then what we ask the model to do is, okay, if we have an analogous situation, what's likely to happen here? And then the model draws on all of that data that's been fed into it from actual sampling that's been done in the past. And that's how the model learns, and that's how it gives us the results. So extensive data is required to validate the model, and the more data, the more accuracy we're able to get in terms of the results. Let's take a look at the next one. So direct measurement. Again, direct measurement, what we're talking about is physically extracting samples of soil and then studying those and taking key data on a number of key parameters. Some of the pros: no need for complex models, no need for sorry, it looks like the slide got cut off. No need for a focus on extensive data sets. For instance, we can just roll it out in each field. Any new field, we can go out there and take a sample and move on, and we don't need to necessarily have extensive pre-existing data sets to draw on. Some cons: we need to be careful about how we handle these samples. It can't just be a willy-nilly approach. We need scientific precision in terms of how, first of all, setting where the plots are, where are we going to take the samples from, how exactly to go about the samples, make sure we're getting the right type of soil and no contaminants in there. Once the samples are taken, we also need to take care of them and make sure that we're treating them with integrity. And then we need to ship them off to a lab. So all of these steps can be costly, and then we need to pay the lab to analyze them. So, Dan mentioned sampling plan before. So let's just say we have 1,000 fields. If we needed to do 1,000 samples on 1,000 fields, obviously that's going to get quite busy and be quite onerous, and the lab's going to be absolutely full, and it's going to cause all sorts of issues. So a number of potential challenges there with respect to what's otherwise a very attractive option here, direct measurement. So again, a robust sampling plan would be needed to ensure that we have sufficient data to accurately model emissions across reductions across the project without being cost prohibitive. So let's look at the next option. So now we're coming back to emission factors. So as we mentioned before, there are a good number of existing conservative emission factors out there, so we would look to make use of those. Or we can also explore developing brand new emission factors during the protocol development process itself. And one way to do so would be to use some of those biogeochemical models we talked about at the start. So what are the pros associated with using emission factors? Well, in essence, especially if we could just pull them off the shelf, it could very greatly simplify quantification and verification. In essence, if in the absence of significant amount of data, we might be able to just pull a single average emission factor off the shelf and plug that into our equations, and away we go. being able to do that could theoretically significantly reduce transaction costs. We wouldn't need to run complex models. We might not need to go out there and gather copious amounts of data on whatever that particular parameter is, if we're able to instead grab a very conservative, simple emission factor, which in effect is an average of a lot of similar data points. What are some of the cons associated with using such emission factors? There are limited availability. Unfortunately, we don't have just an unlimited amount of emission factor for every single parameter that we might want to use in our quantification. Limited availability. Typically very conservative. So why is that a problem? So for project developers out there or farmers out there, you know, the more conservative these emission factors are, the less credits you're going to get by using it. So that's a bit of a trade-off. A lot easier, a lot simpler, but it's probably going to be very conservative. And then if we want to develop new emission factors, and we probably will look to do that, then they can be quite challenging as well, quite costly, time-consuming, and as always, we need a copious amount of robust data in order to build emission factors that are you know, as least conservative as possible and as robust as possible. And putting it bluntly, sometimes that data is lacking. Okay, combination. So why not try to do a bit of all of the above? That's probably what we'll try to do at the outset. So we'll look to use a combination of biogeochemical models, direct measurement, and emission factors. We will look to employ models to be used by project developers directly, quite possibly, and or use those same models to generate brand new emission factors. So we have those off-the-shelf factors for project developers to use. As Dan mentioned, we'll try to bolster any of these approaches by using direct sampling. So direct sampling can help inform the models and refine them further. And then direct sampling can also be used to bolster the data sets that reduce uncertainty across the board. And then obviously relying on default emission factors where appropriate. Sometimes we might offer emission factors when a given farm is unable to produce data for that given parameter. We might say, okay, no problem, here it is, you're allowed to use this default. Or if you like, you can go out and gather together sufficient data to do your own project-specific approach. Typically, we like to try to have a combination of these different alternatives. Some other considerations, some other ways that we can reduce transaction costs, these next 3 dot points here. We'll look to rapidly scale up the area of fields being modeled. We'll look to utilize monitoring, reporting, and verification data to continually validate those models, improve the modeling, and further reduce uncertainty and sampling requirements. So in essence, the more data we gather, the more and more data over time that we're able to pull together. We're improving the efficiencies of all of these processes, and we're reducing the uncertainty and ideally reducing the sampling requirements. And so we're slowly creating efficiency over time as the program builds in size. We'll look to employ machine learning to improve the modeling, to reduce the uncertainty and reduce the sampling requirements. We'll also possibly use remote sensing for a number of key elements, including improving the modeling and or corroborating soil health assessments. So as Dan mentioned, certainly we can look to use remote sensing immediately in order to corroborate things like monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements. In other words, use remote sensing perhaps to demonstrate that certain activity occurred on a certain date. We definitely do that, but we may also be able to start using remote sensing in the longer term to actually improve the modeling and or help predict or corroborate with more accuracy some of those soil health indicators themselves. Okay, let's talk a little bit about monitoring, reporting, and verification. So in terms of monitoring, essentially the requirements can vary greatly, and therefore also the associated transaction costs. And they tend to vary in terms of the volume of information we want, the complexity, how many different parameters do we need you to gather data for, and the frequency that we would need you to gather data for those different parameters. Those tend to vary quite widely depending on the context, depending on the program, the protocol. And then again, the more and more data you have to gather, clearly that starts to have a resource impact, and we consider that as a potentially key transaction cost. So wherever possible, we'll try to simplify things and keep those costs down. One key challenge, historically many farms will lack rigorous data collection systems. So that would certainly be the case on some of the more obscure parameters for which we want data for our greenhouse gas accounting. Might not be anything that's immediately relevant to farmers for their core business, at least not in the past. Requirements are dictated by quantification, additionality, and baseline setting approaches. That's why when we're exploring those various approaches, we need to understand not only how does it affect the accuracy and the number of emission reductions, but what sort of challenges are we presenting people with in terms of transaction costs and in particular those data requirements. We've got to make sure that we balance all of those aspects out. A couple of ideas. We'll look to reduce transaction costs by just a very high level here, standardizing as much as possible, streamlining as much as possible, simplifying everything, limiting requirements, using detailed and standardized guidance so everybody knows exactly what it is that we're wanting people to do. Using templates, something as simple as that can help streamline things. Making use of any existing data gathering and reporting efforts. For instance, if a farm is already engaged in a water quality management program by their local regulator, it might be that we're able to piggyback off that and use some of the reporting mechanisms and some of the actual data that's being reported with respect to meeting the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements. Any chance we get to sort of use pre-existing systems and those data capture methods will be great and can potentially reduce transaction costs. We'll be very interested to see if we can do that. And then making use of new technologies such as remote sensing. Dan went through that really nice little TurboTax for Ag tool that Indigo is developing. That could be a great way, a great example of a type of technology that could potentially very, greatly assist farmers in terms of pulling together the data that we're going to want for monitoring, and then making it easy to report that data, and then making it easy for our third-party verifiers to come in and verify that the information is appropriately characterized. And then lastly, facilitating consolidated reporting for aggregates. How can we streamline this so that we can ideally pull thousands of farms together into great big aggregates? What sort of steps can we take to streamline that collation of data together as much as possible, with the core goal of reducing transaction costs as far as we can? Reporting. So we've got all the data, now what? How do we report it? Again, requirements and associated costs vary, so we'll keep these in mind as we're building these systems out. We'll require a comprehensive monitoring report to summarize all of the results, raw data, quantifying results, and qualitative descriptions. So in other words, all this data has been captured. We then ask that it's consolidated into a nice big single report, and then that report goes to the verifier, and hopefully it's a very informative piece of information that collates the vast majority of things that they'll want to see, and then they'll then go out and request additional information. But this document will ideally be a comprehensive go-to place for most of this information, the monitoring results, raw data, quantification, and qualitative descriptors. How will we look to reduce transaction costs? Again, these are the same dot points we had on the previous slide, so nothing new. It's quite simply look to standardize, streamline, simplify, look to automate as much as possible, look to reduce the potential for errors, make it as easy as possible for people to bring the data in, get it to us, get it to the verifiers, and make it as easy as possible for the verifiers to confirm that the data, the integrity is there and the assertions made are reasonable. And then again, as much as we can facilitate streamlining of these processes at the aggregate level, the better it will be. And now verification. Again, simple high-level statement that requirements will vary and the costs will vary, and we need to try to keep costs under check. So site visits are typically one of the largest contributors, certainly to verification costs, and quite often the single largest cost center for an offset project. So we need to look very closely at what exactly do we want to require with respect to site visits. Typically, site visits are used widely in offset programs, so we need to be able to strike a balance here. If we're talking about thousands of fields all over the country, well, having a third-party human fly out and look at all those fields would be cost prohibitive. So we need to carefully think through exactly what our requirements will be with respect to site visits, as that's likely to be potentially a significant contributor to cost here. Large volumes of raw data will need to be sampled. So again, it'll be cost prohibitive if we force these verifiers to look at every single data point. That's not going to be possible. So we need to use robust sampling methodologies to make sure that this is cost effective but robust nonetheless. And then we're going to be using models and tools quite possibly. So the project developers will be using those. And then invariably, whenever a project developer is using a model or tool as the basis upon which they're quantifying emission reductions, typically it's considered best practice for the verifier to then replicate exactly that type of use of the exact same model and or tool. Sometimes it's explicitly written into a protocol or an offset program. Other times it's simply implicit based on verification best practice that if the project developer is doing it, it's probably going to be high risk, and then therefore myself as a verifier, I'm probably going to want to get my hands on some raw data, want to get my hands on a clean tool, and I'm going to put the data in myself and I'm going to run the model myself. And I'm going to compare the results. So we need to keep that in mind in terms of verification. We need to streamline the front end in terms of the project developers using these processes, but then we also need to keep in mind that the verifier is going to also have a critical step. So we need to think through exactly how we can streamline each of those. What will we do to reduce transaction costs? Again, these are the same generic statements we made on with respect to the other two, monitoring and reporting. So general mantra, streamline, standardize, simplify as much as possible, and in particular, try to facilitate aggregates as best as we can. Right, well, that was a lot. Hopefully you're all still with us and you found that useful. So now we'll get into a little bit of the next steps. What do we expect going forward? So right at the start, we had a little bit of a simplified version of this where we told you we're going to push ahead with a 6-month process, and at the end we're going to celebrate with a finished protocol. Here we've got a little bit more of a detailed breakdown. So the first line there is what we're doing today. It's our public scoping meeting. Next, we said a couple of times, for those of you who are very generously putting your hand up to express interest to join us for the work group, thank you for that. Very critical part of the process. We would ask that you submit a statement of interest form to us by Friday, so January the 17th. That's this Friday, 2 days from now. Next, we will form the work group, so we'll probably do that next week. As soon as we come back from MLK Day, we'll look to form the work group straight away and get moving. Next, after that, reserve staff will be conducting internal research and drafting the protocol. So throughout January, we're going to be getting our hands right into the protocol and start to build it out. From there, first work group meeting, I think we tentatively suggested January the 30th. I think we'll probably come back to you sometime soon and look to push that out at this stage, possibly February the 5th, but we'll reach out to all the work group members to make sure they're aware of it. But at this point, that date is still a little bit in flux, so we'll let you know as soon as possible with respect to that. And then from there, the second work group meeting, late February is what we're thinking is probably a good timing for that. In terms of a third work group meeting, hopefully we grab the work group for a third meeting. We're thinking North American Carbon World, that's our annual conference. This year it's right at the end of March, moving through to the first couple of days of April. That quite possibly will be an opportune time to have a third work group meeting. Still tentative at this stage, obviously. It's quite a way down the line. Then from there, once the protocol is complete, we will open up a public comment period that will go for 30 days. Hopefully that will be around April and May. We'll post the full protocol up on our website. We'll let everybody know, and then the public will have a chance to get in there and look at the entire document. And then we'll be inviting written comments at the end of that period. And we always respond in writing publicly to all written comments that are submitted during that public comment process. So we very much appreciate that feedback, and we get in there, and quite often we'll be making edits to the protocol based on the very useful feedback we received during that public comment period. And as I mentioned before, we will drop a public comment webinar in the middle, most likely, of that 30-day period. Somewhere in the middle there, we'll probably repeat similar to what we did today, but obviously with the protocol in hand, we'll be able to walk you through the document itself and probably highlight some of those key challenges that we went through today. So what did we do for permanence? This is what we've come up with, and walk you through exactly what we've come up with and explain a little bit of the why. And at that point, we might even, we possibly we'll be highlighting specific areas that we want you to focus on and in terms of the public comments, quite possibly. And then from there, right at the end, we're going to be having a nicely polished, finished protocol that we'll present to the Climate Action Reserve Board, and we'll be asking them to approve it. And we expect that to be on around June the 10th. I think that's when we have our board meeting. And then if and when the board approves, we celebrate at that point. So next steps. Again, for interested stakeholders, sorry to drum it in, but the work group's obviously a critical part of this process. So anybody who's interested, grab that form and send it to us by Friday. We very much appreciate that. We've got a good number of folks who've done it already. We know there's definitely a few more out there that are interested. We've heard that, so get your form in and we'll be very grateful to see that. And then from there, you know, if you don't think that you'll be well suited, or you don't think you'll have the time for the work group, you're certainly welcome to email us and nonetheless sign up for updates as an observer. So as an observer, you'll basically be plugged into all of those key developments. You just won't be asked to sort of actively participate and provide feedback, but you'll certainly be kept abreast of all the developments. So anybody who's interested, let us know and we can sign you up as an observer and make sure that you're fully informed. And then, you know, even if you're not signing up for the work group or as an observer, feel free to email us feedback anytime. I like to keep it, well, relatively formal, but at the same time, very welcome to receive feedback at any time. And in a moment, you'll get some key contact email addresses and you can make sure that you can shoot us your thoughts at any point in the process. And then for the reserve, we're going to form the work group next week. We're going to start drafting and then aiming for that first work group meeting. So it does say there January 30th in person, but that's still in flux. So let me get back to you all, especially those who put your hand up to get on the work group, that we might revise that slightly. Key contacts. So we've got a general policy email address, so policy@climateactionreserve.org. So feel free to shoot an email to the policy team there. Also, you have my details there. So again, Sammy Osmond, Senior Policy Manager. So you can send me an email. It's just SOSMAN@Climate Action Reserve, or send an email to both Policy and myself. That's how you get in contact with Climate Action Reserve in respect to this project. So feel free to reach out anytime you want to get in touch with me. And then if you get a response, you'll have my phone number there, so you'll be able to call as well. And then in terms of Indigo Agriculture, we've got Max Stubison, who's the Director of Carbon Operations for Methodology, and that's his email address there. So if you want specifically to get in touch with Indigo Ag, the best person to reach out to would be Max, and that's his email address there. Again, we'll be posting a copy of this slide deck and a recording of the presentation, so you'll have our contact details just in case you're wondering how to get in touch with us. Oh, it's gone dark. So that's it for the webinar at this point, and it looks like we have finished early. So we did say at the start that we would potentially address questions at the end. That's sometimes a little bit challenging, especially if your questions are tricky, but let me pause for a moment and just take a little look through those questions and just see if we can identify some that we can address in the remaining part of the webinar today. So first question, is all of this done through Indigo, as in there's no opportunity for other project developers? So great question. No, it's that's oh, sorry, was it somebody else?
This is Greg. I'll take that one, Sammy.
Sure.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. It's the first one that came through. Is this sort of Indigo Ag specific? And the answer is absolutely not. Indigo is part of this to provide more granularity around some of the advancements that have happened in this field that we think will make a new protocol possible, but it's certainly not the sum total of what those advancements are. For those of you who are familiar with the Climate Action Reserve's approach to protocol development, we always stress standardized baseline development, seeking the widest possible geographies and approaches that we can bring to market. So part of the challenge I think the work group faces, and all of us face in this, and that's why we're glad that all of you joined today, is to make sure that the generalized protocol that we develop over the next several months is reflective of the best state of the art possible. So just wanted to make that very clear moving forward. And this is, again, a reminder, the start of the process. So we're simply trying to highlight what we think, what some of the key challenges are, as well as some of the key advancements. But we're counting on all of you to make sure that the outcome is as high quality as possible and has a widespread applicability.
Great, thanks, Greg. Let's see, I think we've got a number of other questions. Ooh, just lost a question box. So another question we had is, what type of biogeochemical models are we going to use? So at the outset, we can tell you that we're probably going to at least explore the use of DNDC, but we know that there's going to be some proponents who may be suggesting the use of Comet Farm. So likely at least exploring the use of both of those. But at this point in the process, you know, we're in theory agnostic as to exactly which approaches we would be, you know, exploring. So it's very much early stages open, but I would suggest to you DNDC is likely to be a point of focus right from the start, as well as potentially Comet Farm. And obviously, if you're interested in joining us on the work group or submitting other thoughts via email, etc., feel free to reach out if there's specific feedback you'd like to give us, you know, with respect to that specific issue. Next question: have you chosen or shortlisted any biogeochemical models? Yes. In theory, well, you know, maybe not shortlisted, but yeah, as I said, at this point, we are definitely going to be exploring DNDC and quite possibly Comet Farm, but certainly open to any other suggestions. In particular, if you want to send us an SOI and join us on the work group, that'll be the best way we can have robust discussions about your favorite model or feedback on some of those early ideas. Next question. Mentioned establishing a baseline per operation, looking at additionality based on practice change. Assume this excludes early good actors, or does your approach set a baseline based on commonplace farms? I'm not suggesting one is better than the other, just looking for clarification. So a great question, thanks for that. So yes, in setting baselines, there's often a challenge with respect to how do we make sure we're only crediting new activities or additional activities, but at the same time, how do we not disadvantage those farmers who have sort of blazed a trail and shown us what's possible by moving early. That is a challenge which we always need to, you know, strive balance in terms of the approach. We can't say at this point, it's a little bit too early, but that'll be probably addressed by a number of means. One, you know, we talked about how many years worth of data do we need for the baseline. That'll be one way we do it. Also, quite possibly, we see in offset programs where a specific date might be chosen. And, you know, for instance, the California Compliance Offset Program talks about after December 31st, 2006. So it might be that we're able to say anything after this date can be considered additional. Or quite possibly, we would look to have each project establish that based on setting their baseline with X number of years before the start date. Those are common approaches. Too early to say exactly how we will do it, but certainly we'll be sensitive to strike a balance between additionality and not disadvantaging those folks who've blazed the trail and shown us what's possible by moving as early actors. Yeah, thanks to all of you for the questions. A good number of questions and some really good questions there. And just for you folks, I think there's maybe one or two that put your hand up instead of using a question box. It's probably best if you type a question into the question chat box function rather than putting your hand up. It would just be a little bit logistically easier for us. So if you could reroute your thoughts through that, that'll be easier. Next question. The samples are very much grouped in the middle of the US. Is this the only eligible project area? So I think you're talking about these slides from Indigo. So short answer, no. That was just some nice graphics that Indigo have used to demonstrate, you know, the types of technologies that they might be using. We are hoping to target the entire US to start with. As to exactly what project areas will be eligible, again, it's going to be based on data. For instance, if we are using a biogeochemical model, we will only be able to have eligible areas be areas that for which the model is validated. There are going to be some key sort of considerations which delimit, determine eligibility in terms of project area. It's not so much us saying, my favorite is Kansas, I want all of Kansas in. It's going to be driven by data, and we're going to expand it as much as possible over time, you know, based on the limitations presented by availability of data. So no is the short answer, but we'll have to see exactly where those lines end up being. Next question, would perennial wheat Kernza grown in NA and Europe fit the experimental proposal? Ooh, a very specific question. Cannot answer that at this outset. Let's break that down a little bit. Europe, most likely not. We're probably not going to have enough time to get to Europe, enough time to crunch all the data to get to Europe in that short 6-month time frame. But we would look to build this out as broadly applicable as possible over time. But in terms of North America, again, quite possibly, but it's going to be the data that drives eligibility in terms of geography, eligible practices, and eligible crops. And in essence, it's probably going to boil down to a combination of all of those. So you pick any specific part of the country, it's probably going to end up being a finite list of practices and crops that are eligible for that specific part of the country, simply because there will be limited data from different parts of the country, and the quantification will need to be fed by that complex combination of climatic conditions, activities done by the farmers, soil conditions. All of these variables will have to go into the quantification. So it's not a matter of us simply picking and choosing. It's going to be really driven by the data. So hard to say at this point, but Europe, very, very high chance it won't be included. North America, quite possibly. Perennial wheat, possibly. Next question. Has there been any discussions about the 6-month requirement to be eligible? That is to say, if we close a conservation more than 6 months in advance, could that ever be eligible? Yeah, so we addressed this question already to some extent. Quite possibly, no. Short answer, no, we have not made any determinations about lines drawn in the sand, whereby if you're on this side, you're eligible, on that side, you're not. Tough considerations, and very high on our list in terms of, you know, making sure we balance appropriately between not disadvantaging those early movers, but at the same time ensuring the integrity of this whole program by making sure we don't clearly hand out credits where it's not additional to do so. That's a sensitive balance, and no, we have not at this point come up with any lines in the sand with respect to where that cutoff might be. Very open to your suggestions if you have any specific thoughts. Next question. Do the GHG models with reductions match the NIR methodologies and reporting? Great question. So, I mean, on a very basic level, yes. So it will be informed by the same core principles, but the NIR, if you can appreciate, NIR is a national inventory reporting. It's obviously at a level, at a scale that's much higher, right? So what we need to do, and a key challenge, and a key reason why we keep throwing around the word uncertainty and data, is that we need to zoom in on a much more finite level. We need to zoom in on a specific field, quantify with reasonable accuracy the GHG impacts on that field. So for that reason, some of the defaults used at the national level or international level may not be so useful, or they're likely to be very conservative. So that's, again, a balance between accuracy and cost effectiveness that we've talked about throughout. Was that somebody else who wanted to make a comment? Sounded like, perhaps? No? Okay. But feel free, anybody else on the team who wants to address it. Otherwise, I'll keep moving through these, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, and then any that left over we'll reach out to you via email. So next question. In addition to cropping, could this protocol be used for grassland restoration? So the focus here is on activities related to cropping. But in essence, in theory, some of those same activities, you know, it might be possible that grassland restoration could be included peripherally, because ultimately, if you think about the types of quantification approaches we're talking about the use of models, we're talking about potentially the use of default emission factors, maybe direct sampling. It could be that you're able to demonstrate on your grassland restoration field that we're able to use those same approaches to show the soil organic carbon benefits of that activity. So it might be possible that we're able to include those activities. And in fact, if you think back to the initial list that our friends at Indigo pointed out, it did include a number of pasture-related activities and incorporating livestock. So it is not the immediate focus, but it's possible that initially we'll be able to include that, and certainly over time we can look to build out that functionality even further.
Sammy?
Next question. Yes.
If you don't mind, I'll take the next three for you and let you catch your breath.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Okay. The next question had to do with what would be required for Mexico to be eligible for this protocol ASAP. You know, our initial efforts here are focused around primarily the U.S., possibly Canada market. However, I want to clarify, we think conceptually there's no reason there should be geographic limitations on the type of practices we're talking about. But for those of you, again, familiar with the space, it's not necessarily that easy to represent a wide variety of jurisdictional practices. So I just want to make it clear that at this initial stage, we're focused primarily on U.S.-centric practices, but we'll have to see as it evolves over time the ability and capacity to expand this to to other jurisdictions. So stay tuned for that. Had another question. Do you anticipate trying to submit this protocol for use in any compliance-based carbon markets in the U.S. and or internationally? If so, which ones? That is not on our radar screen at this point. We are certainly amenable for consideration for any of our protocols for use in a compliance market, but that is obviously not our call. There are various jurisdictions that are examining additional compliance protocols, including in California, but ultimately is up to those regulatory authorities to decide whether they want to adopt something out of the voluntary market for use in the compliance market. Of course, everything we do here at the Climate Action Reserve, whether it's in the voluntary markets or the compliance market, are all done at the same level of rigor and transparency. So we think it would be ready-made for use in a compliance market, but obviously that is not our choice. So if there's any further questions on that, by all means, do let us know. And next question was, what do they expect this protocol to pay to farmers? Where would the money come from, and how certain would this market be? Lots of great questions, and honestly, I'm going to punt on any specifics about that. Here at the reserve, we don't get involved in the decisions about what a project developer pays to any landowner. The money obviously would come from the sale of carbon credits coming from the change in practices, and we have expectations that this could be a very large market. As the IPCC highlighted in one of our earlier slides, the potential for soil enhancement and other natural working land solutions is simply tremendous worldwide. So that's a very big number, and we certainly feel that these types of natural working land solutions have to be a critical component responding to climate change. But issues around the prices that will be paid, obviously we'll leave that to the buyer and seller. So Sammy, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Lots more tricky questions. So thanks, folks. Keep them coming. Next question: how would this protocol interact with the reserve's nitrogen management protocol? Oh, that's a tough one. Good question. So too early to say. What we can tell you is that Indigo and the reserve are both very much interested in exploring nitrogen, nitrous oxide impacts, nitrogen fertilizer impacts with respect to soil carbon, and also with respect to N2O and any other emissions. So we will be exploring it. I guess in theory we could copy paste the nitrogen management protocol that we've already released and paste it in here We could do something like referring people over there to the other protocol, and if you use that, you can get those emissions. Or it might be that we look to incorporate the impacts of nitrogen management activities by using one of those biogeochemical models, or we could look to develop new emission factors the same way we did with the nitrogen management protocol, using one of those biogeochemical models. So at this point, it's too early to say, but certainly it is an area that we'll be focusing on closely. And you know, one option might be that we somehow try to incorporate the pre-existing methodology and just use those existing mechanisms. So stay tuned and good question. Next, dollars per acre net. Not too much detail there, but I think the essence is, what are we looking at here? Very early days. I guess we can throw out some very general numbers, but you know, in theory, the technical abatement potential for a lot of these activities is perhaps.
Gone to the question I already answered, and I don't think we want to speculate on what the value is per acre.
Yep, noted. All right, our fearless leader Craig already addressed that one, which takes it off my plate, thankfully. Let's go to the next question. Would the use of activated biochar be an eligible practice under the fertilizer category? So let's break that down a little bit. So, you know, it might come down to what quantification approaches we use, right? So in other words, if we're using a biogeochemical model, that biogeochemical model is able to, if one of the feed-in parameters is biochar and it's able to tell us what the impacts are, well, then the answer could very well be yes. If we are using a direct sampling approach, then it doesn't really matter what you put in your field. You could put biochar or coal or anything else. If the observable, measurable effects are an increase in soil carbon, well, then in that sense, indirectly, sure, we would be capturing the benefit. So another way to respond is that we are not specifically looking at biochar per se, but if the addition of biochar was to result in soil organic carbon increases, then depending on the quantification methodology, hopefully we would be able to capture that. Hopefully we're able to capture the GHG impacts and the soil organic carbon increases from any number of practices, even ones that aren't specifically listed. Hopefully it'll be a relatively neutral approach, but that will depend heavily on the specific quantification approach or combination thereof. But certainly if you'd like to get in touch with us with some thoughts, feel free to reach out again. Might be worth mentioning that separately the reserve has been looking at biochar from time to time, but in this specific effort, it may not be a immediate line of focus, but hopefully we'd be able to catch the benefits nonetheless. The next question, how much will farmers be compensated, how and when? So as Craig said, he's already addressed that to some degree, and largely it's out of the reserve's sphere of influence. So I think that's been addressed, but certainly reach out if you wanted to talk that through. Next question. The Soil Health Partnership has extensive soil sampling data from hundreds of Midwest farms. Is it possible that this data can be incorporated into this protocol? And does the Comet Farm program play any role? So yes, the Soil Health Partnership is doing a lot of fantastic work. I think I might have seen an email even this morning about some latest developments, but you know, we would look to make use of all available data sets that are relevant. So the more data that's available, the better, more efficient we'll be able to make this program. So certainly no stone will be left unturned in that respect. And then with respect to the specific models, we already addressed that at the start. At this point, we can tell you that we will probably be looking at DNDC, and quite possibly we'll be looking at Comet Farm. We've worked very closely with a number of world-renowned scientific experts, including those who work very closely with Comet Farm, so we're very familiar with it and got a lot of respect for it. So certainly that could quite possibly be something that we at least study closely, but too early to say at this point exactly how the quantification approaches will be developed. Next question. Could you please put up the first Indigo Ag slide? Let me get back to you about that, maybe, but let me get through the rest of the questions. But don't fear, because we're going to upload a copy of the slide deck, so you'll be able to have your own personal version. You can run through them as many times as you like. But bear with me, we might. We've got a thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. Next question. Is the ultimate goal a high quality standardization that must practically be used by any company that is creating a marketplace for land-related carbon credit offsets? Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit. So when we're developing protocols, as much as possible, we try to build in standardization. And that's, as we mentioned a few times, standardization tends to be a useful way to reduce transaction costs, right? So in that sense, for sure. But we also typically need to balance that against being flexible. Standardization sometimes implies putting boundaries around what's possible and exactly defining what's possible. So we need to balance that with perhaps having a little bit of room to move, a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of flexibility. So that's one part of the question. Secondly, will it be used by any company? So the way it works is that we develop protocols, we adopt them, our board adopts them, and then they're available for use within our program. In other words, if you wanted to have carbon credits developed using that protocol and issued by our program, then yes, you would come to us and you would develop a project in our registry using our offsets. Sometimes our protocols might get adopted into, let's say, a compliance program. That's happened in the past, in particular in California. So it could be that eventually this protocol is used in a compliance market. That's not for us to say. It's a little bit speculative, as Craig mentioned. But at least initially, the idea is we will be adopting a protocol in June. Our board will adopt it. And then from that point forward, you would be able to launch, develop an offsets program in our registry using that protocol, and you would be issued credits by us at the end, and then we'll celebrate. Next question.
Sammy?
Yes.
Let me add a little more to that, and I'll also take the next question. The question we're addressing also talks about creating a marketplace for land-related carbon credits offsets. I want to make it very clear that that's a very large category of potential activities, and we're expressly focused on soil enhancement practices around cropping. There are a variety of other things that could be considered, but we obviously won't be addressing that. That goes to the next question as well. It talks about, will methane reduction from cattle be incorporated? No. Again, we're talking about changes in cropping practices solely for this. I think we already feel that this is a huge undertaking, as we discussed at the outset, to come up with a robust, transparent, and high quality protocol in this space. So to some extent, we obviously need to minimize how broadly we're trying to cast the net.
Excellent, thanks, Craig. Next question looks like a tricky one, so thank you for sending that one in. What TIC method do you recommend to reduce error in dry combustion? Acid pretreatment or two-step temperature instruments? So interesting question. So that relates to direct measurement, and in particular, what sort of methodology do we think the lab is going to employ when they're using what is quite possibly the most accurate method for actually measuring the soil when it gets to the lab, dry combustion method. So if we do end up using direct measurement approach, quite possibly we will specify minimum requirements, or it might be that we don't, and we point to any reputable methodology. A little bit too early, and I'm not quite well informed enough at this point to answer. Certainly not to answer a level of that detail, but quite possibly we would defer that to best practice. So we would be asking the scientific members of the work group to tell us, do you think we need to recommend a TIC method? Is that necessary? Should we just leave it open? Are there 2 or 3 that we can list and let folks choose themselves? What's the best approach? So that's typically how somebody like myself, who doesn't have the scientific knowledge, would look to answer a question like that. And I can tell you at this point, we don't have any concrete suggestions, if that makes sense. Next question. This method sounds complex. Would incentivizing best management practices work and be easier? Yeah, good question. And yes, it is complex. So maybe if we step back a bit, what we're trying to do here is not only drive practice change, but we're trying to create this commodity with enough finite detail on exactly how many emission reductions have occurred, so that those offsets can then be sold to an entity which is a heavy polluter potentially, and we know with a lot of precision exactly what emissions they're generating. So the whole idea of an offset is that it's used so that people somewhere else in the economy can reduce their emissions in a more cost-effective manner. So for that reason, we're not just trying to drive best practices on farm. We actually need to do a little bit more of a complex, detailed study of the greenhouse gas impacts. So those types of incentives, there are a lot around, and they're growing day by day, and that's fantastic. And hopefully we would be able to complement whatever those existing incentives are. But for this particular effort, we need to go a little bit further and really take the effort to accurately measure exactly or model exactly what's happening. But absolutely, it is going to be complex. So one thing to keep in mind is that, say you're a farmer and you're already doing these sorts of things and you're interested, but it sounds complex, not to worry. What you would do is reach out to a third-party expert project developer, and Indigo Ag is putting their hand up as saying, well, we're interested in doing just that type of thing, and there will be a number of others that will do the same. And you would hire those parties, and they would develop the offset project themselves, handle all of that complexity. The farmer would do the activities, the project developer would handle the complexity, and at the end of the day, there'd be some sort of remuneration for both of those parties. So that's one way where parties might be able to engage in this without necessarily needing to understand fully exactly all the different type of complexity and be able to undertake all those actions. So yes, it's complex, but we will hopefully build it in a way to reduce that, and then also there will be third parties that can step in and play the role to take care of a lot of that complexity. So great question, thanks for that. Next question, we've got, let's do a quick time check, 9 minutes, so I'll try to get through as many as we can. Regarding handling regulatory compliance, what consideration of water quality regulations will play into definition of additionality for nutrient and irrigation management practices that are eligible to generate questions? Ooh, tough one. So, what consideration of water quality regulations will play into the definition of additionality for nutrient and irrigation management? Yeah, that's a tough one. So quite possibly in some parts of the country, for instance, California, typically some of the more robust regulatory programs, if there are quantitative regulations in place with respect to how much nutrients can be put out there, well then quite possibly that will serve as some sort of quantitative limit which affects additionality. If there are simply qualitative or aspirational goals or a bit more of an informal regulatory process, well then there's probably less of a chance of a direct impact in terms of additionality, if that makes sense. And then the second part, regulatory compliance, might not necessarily be tied to additionality or quantification. It might be just a more of a broad general statement that, look, what we'll probably do is try to push environmental integrity as much as possible by simply saying, look, offsets, we're promoting this stuff, but we need you to comply with all laws, especially environmental ones, especially things like water quality. So if you go dumping a bunch of chemicals into the river, it will probably affect the number of credits we give you, just as a general statement. So tricky question, but pretty good one, and I've hopefully addressed it. Next question. Does the proposed methodology include considerations of indirect land use change or leakage? Short answer, yes. We'll have to consider leakage. Best practice in carbon accounting dictates that we consider leakage. Exactly how we do that remains to be seen. We're talking about potentially all sorts of complex activities, parts of the country, et cetera, et cetera. So short answer, yes. How we do it, not sure yet. If you have ideas, let us know and send us an SOI in particular. Next question. Could existing agricultural easements be utilised to establish permanence, or is the potential protocol only considering new easements? So probably a little bit early for that, but I would say at this point, an existing easement would not necessarily rule things out, because what we are looking at is an additional practice, most likely. The easement will probably be just as a sort of a safeguard to make sure that bad things don't happen. But most likely, additionality won't be driven by the easement, as it is in the case of, a forestry project or one of our grassland projects. In those instances, we're talking about using the easement to establish the project and establish additionality. Here, we're probably not. Here, we're probably talking about you adopt a new one or more of those eligible practices. So, cover cropping, tilling, etc. So if you do that, you're additional. And then to safeguard permanence, perhaps you would use an easement, and perhaps you could use a pre-existing easement. But again, this is early days, so we haven't exactly delineated how we will approach those issues. But I think probably pre-existing easements wouldn't be necessarily a barrier to you being able to do a project on those lands. But again, early days. Next question, what methods do you think will increase soil carbon? The presentation seems to focus more on measurements. What methods will farmers adopt to increase soil carbon in a large way? Yeah, good question. So at the start, we listed a few general ideas, those NRCS practice change types, and then Indigo had a slide where there was a whole bunch of different stuff. So basically it could be, one of many things, including changes in tillage, changes in irrigation, the use of cover crops, the use of mulches, the sort of reduction in synthetic nitrogen, all of those things that are being promoted by a whole bunch of different agencies and organisations around the country. It's all of those same common ideas. If somebody, a university extension folk or a scientist or some policy wonk is telling you that it's going to increase soil carbon, quite possibly those activities will be things that we're looking at and things that will be included. Ideally, we'll make this as broadly applicable as possible, if that makes sense. What mechanism might exist for ensuring permanence? Easements seem more applicable for permanent forests or grasslands and not so much for annual croplands. Yeah, good question. Easements may be useful, maybe not. Some of those other ideas we talked about, things like a buffer pool that works well in forestry. We might also use that ton-year accounting practice where, we say, all right, well, if you want to just do it for 10 years, we'll give you 1/10 of the credits. And that way you can just, at the end of the day, you can take off a little bit sooner. You don't have to safeguard it for 100 years. We might also explore things like insurance. We're open to exploring any ideas, and those are probably the best pre-existing concepts out there that we'll look to build from. Next question, do you anticipate there being a minimum number of acres in order to be eligible? Short answer, no. The acreage will determine feasibility. So it'll be more a case of, if you've only got a handful of acres, it's probably going to be tough for the numbers to be crunched and look favorable. So you might want to instead join a project developer. There'll probably be a number out there, including somebody like Indigo Ag, who are in theory looking to pull together as many farmers as they can into one big, huge project or a bunch of projects. If you've got a small acreage, it might be more cost effective to join an aggregate. But there probably won't be any limits. It'll just be a matter of what's practical. Only 3 minutes left, 3 more questions. Let's see. How, if at all, does the protocol relate to the work of the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium? So they're doing very similar efforts, and they're hoping to develop a protocol which will look to generate both offsets and, I think, water quality and maybe even water quality credits or attributes. So their work will be similar. So hopefully both our processes are able to do well. So theirs will be slightly different approach. Perhaps we haven't seen a draft method, so I can't comment on that. But as soon as it's available, we'll definitely be looking at it to see what lessons we can learn from that. But in essence, it'll hopefully be relatively similar. So we're all trying to drive that same practice change, those activity types that we talked about, those NRCS practice types. Hopefully we're all able to drive practice change. The next one says thanks, so thank you. Next one, last one, lucky last. Are you considering ex-ante carbon credits? Not at this point. This specific activity is for offsets, and offsets will be won't be considering ex-ante, but we have a separate program, Climate Forward program, which we do explore ex-ante, and we could quite possibly look at this amongst many other project types in that program. It's a completely different program. Offsets will not be looking at ex-ante. And we have 1 minute left, so I think probably a big thank you is in order. We actually got through all the questions. So thank you for submitting all your questions. Here on this slide here, you have our contact details. As we mentioned, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar and the slides up there as well. So feel free to reach out. Myself, again, is the middle one there, Sammy Osmond. We've also got the policy email address, and Max down the bottom at Indigo. I'll just pause there in case anybody else wants to say a big thank you too. But thanks, folks. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well from the Indigo side. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Indigo folks. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks again. Really appreciate it. And yeah, get in touch. Let's build this together. Thanks, guys. All the best. Cheers.